Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Gilbert Gallegos. I'm with the Albuquerque Police Department. And for those of you who were at our officer-involved shooting presentation about a month or two ago, we kind of took a deep dive into trends and that sort of thing. We're doing something similar with homicide offenders. And our thought was, since we have made so many arrests this year as a department, I think there's 119 arrests we've made, or the individuals deceased. It's a lot more people by far than the department has ever seen. So we wanted to kind of take a collective look into who the offenders are and kind of ethnicity, race, those sorts of things, but also any trends we could identify. And then just like the OISs, we'll post them on the website, and that way anyone else could kind of take a look and research it and see what they come up with. So this is a little informal, just like last time. I'll go through the slides that we have up here. We'll send out the slides afterward. And Chief Medina, and we have Commander Vega and Deputy Chief Barker will kind of be available to just jump in whenever they want. If they want to say something about any particular trend or figures, they'll do so. And then we'll answer any questions about any of this. But we'll start things off with Chief saying a few words.
I just want to thank everybody for being here today. Last year in February, I went to the state legislature, and it was, the center of the discussion was there accountability in Albuquerque for homicides? Over and over, it came up again that we needed to increase our clearance rate, we needed to arrest more individuals, and that part of the problem in Albuquerque was the fact that there was no accountability. And after several committee meetings and several times that this was brought up, we knew we had to make a difference. We had already put new leadership in place. We had already started the design of a detective academy because we knew that it was a problem even before the state legislature. I want to thank everybody in this room who has helped make this change possible. Deputy Chief Barker was my chief of staff when she started developing the detective academy. We are now starting our 4th detective academy in January. We've added another week to it. And all these changes have made a huge difference. Commander Vega came back from retirement. Him, along with Deputy Commander Hartsuck, have made huge changes. We had some people leave homicide, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We have a lot of young detectives in there who are doing a fabulous job, and we're very happy because ultimately what we wanted to do was we wanted to bring justice to the families left behind from a lot of these homicides. And you're going to see that as Gilbert goes through this, there's been some really big highlights this past year in terms of homicides. And I think that sometimes we forget some of those key arrests, whether it was the Muslim case, which got national attention. We had some massage businesses where homicides occur who were able to quickly make arrests, all the way through some of our most recent homicides that we're able to make key arrests quickly. They're doing a great job. They've become very proactive, and this, in the end, has helped us really bring a sense of justice to a lot of the families, a sense of closure. They'll never bring their loved ones back, but we know that it's very difficult for us to prevent homicides. But I think that eventually we'll have enough individuals in custody where it will make a difference. So we'll continue to work hard. We'll continue to give them the support they need, and hopefully they could continue to bring that sense of justice to all the families that have been affected by these terrible incidents. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Gilbert.
Just one other note too, the Chief didn't mention it, but he, I'm not sure who all was there, visited with family members of homicide victims last week. Is that right? Had kind of another kind of town hall meeting private with them. And we did that last year with the mayor and others, and that kind of prompted us to really expand our victim advocacy assistance program and just really focus a lot more on victims. So everything we say here today doesn't, discount the victims. In fact, this is all about the victims. It also doesn't discount those families of loved ones whose cases have not yet been solved. I know a lot of them will go to the media and they're frustrated and they see our attention on these ones that have been solved, but it doesn't mean detectives aren't still working on those other cases. So just wanted to start with that.
And I think it's important just to mention that we have added in other places other than the sworn resources, getting up to 16 detectives. We did talk about the victim advocates and bringing in a team from that used to work for the DA's office and hiring them under the city to help us with mining social media and digital forensics has been a big key to also a lot of their success, as you've all read through a lot of the criminal complaints over the past year.
So these are just some of the basic numbers, which we'll hand out to you guys. So we have 90 cases solved, just murder, non-negligent murder. So those are just straight homicides. 68 cases from this year out of 112 total cases. And then that's 119 victims. That's what our homicide number is right now. So that's an incredible number. That's about 61% of the total from this year. But I think just the other remarkable number is the 22 cases from previous years. If you look historically, when you look at clearance rates, you look at what cases are solved in the current year that are from previous years or arrests made. And usually there's maybe 3, 4, or 5 from a previous year. This year, we've solved 22 cases from previous years. And if you go down further, so we've made 81 arrests, 36 arrests from previous years. And those are arrested, charged, or deceased. So it may be, we'll see a further slide where some are still wanted. I think there's about 10 who are still wanted, but they've been charged. And I forget how many have been deceased, maybe 10 or 11, who for one reason or another, or there's a murder, suicide, or they died after being a suspect or charged. So I mentioned the clearance rate. 62% was the percent of this year's cases that have been solved. The clearance rate, which is typically looked at nationally, is a mathematic calculation that looks at those previous years as well. Also justifiable, and then negligent murders. So if you see this year, we have solved one negligent murder. I think there hasn't been an arrest in that case. So you start adding all these numbers, and then there's 15 closed justifiable cases from this year and previous years. So you take all of those, and that's 119 solved or closed cases for the year. And then here's a historical trend for the last 11 years of clearance rates. I was reading recently obviously we don't know the national clearance rate for this year to see what that looks like, but over the past 20, 30 years, clearance rates have gone down, trended down significantly. I did read somewhere, maybe it was last year, that nationally it was probably closer to 50%. I've seen other articles saying it's typically around 60% nationally. You can see over the last several years, they've been pretty low for Albuquerque. But this is the big number that kind of factors everything in. I went back and looked at some old newspaper articles and TV articles, stories from the past, even going back to the 80s, 90s, and generally they've been pretty high. The 100% in 2013, interestingly, is there were 35 cases that year. They solved 30, but plus 5 from previous years, so that's how they came up with the 100% clearance rate. If you also kind of look, crime started rising in Albuquerque significantly up into 2017, and then homicides kept going up, and it's kind of flattened out. Kind of coincides with the clearance rates as well. I think they've really spiked. It's become tougher to solve these cases. You know, I saw different years, different numbers of detectives, so that seems to be a huge thing. As the chief said, we've really ramped up the number of detectives, training, and all of that, so that's probably contributing.
You know, I think it's important to remember too on that past slide is, you know, Gilbert mentioned it. In 2013, there were 35 homicides. You know, and that number has increased over 14, 15, 16. So, you know, we may have had some years that were flat. I think 17, 18, 19 kind of were flat, slight reductions. But for the most part, you have to look at back to 2013 till now, there has been a gradual increase in homicides.
So this is what I was mentioning earlier. So 81 suspects from this year, 7 are deceased, 10 are charged and considered wanted. So we have, we're still looking for these suspects, and occasionally we're putting out information. I think we might step it up of who's wanted and get more attention to them. We've also utilized the U.S. Marshal with a huge number, you know, of people we're looking for with murder charges. We've worked with the U.S. Marshals. Anyone else on just apprehensions, state police, when we've needed help. I want to say during the Muslim murders when we were really tied up, we got some of that help, I think, right? Looking for other offenders. Everyone stepped up to help us. 36 suspects from previous years. This is a breakdown of those previous years. So, you know, the vast majority were from last year. Last year, we only solved about 36% of all the cases that year. So there was a lot of active cases. So we've tackled a number of those this year, or reached a conclusion anyway. And then we've had cold case detectives or just others. You want to explain that with some of those detectives and what the resources we put in there to kind of solve some of these cases?
You know, in cold cases, one of those units where we're utilizing them to more quickly look at cases, and cases don't stay active as long. In 2021, we started closing cases out earlier and transferring them over to cold case. And we also had a detective who had been in homicide that was transferred to cold case, and they've been working a lot of these cases. And I know there's other cases in the pipeline. Do you want to talk about any of those? Or?
Talk a little bit about the homicide investigators, also our temps that we've hired.
Go ahead.
The other thing that we did do now for 2022 is we hired temps who were previous police officers that had investigative experience to look at some of these previous cases that we do have coming through. And what they do is they work the investigation from start to about to the point where we're needing an arrest warrant. And then we're able to do a soft handoff to a sworn police officer to write these arrest warrants. So, you know, when you put all those three in combination, when you put our homicide detectives are working the current cases and some of the cases just, you know, from years past, then we have our cold case team looking into some of the cold cases. And now we have these homicide investigators working some of these other cases that are coming through and being able to get us to warrant. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of the success, because we're having a lot of different people looking at these cases and pushing these cases a lot further.
You know, and part of these individuals that they brought back that are helping with some of these cases, that's why sometimes during the year you've seen that a case started out active at one point in time years ago, and then it kind of laid dormant, and we've gotten questions over that, like, hey, why did that happen? It was just we didn't have the investigative skills for a variety of reasons, and cases weren't moving as quickly. So what these officers have been able to bring back to the table is that's why we continually tell victims that don't give up, because even though the case has been dormant for a period of time, we have people that are putting fresh eyes on it, trying to move these cases forward.
Correct. Yeah, and we got accountability measures in place now to where we're going back and looking at these cases. My team, Lieutenant Del Greco and Deputy Commander Hartsock, they go through these cases, sit down with these investigators, and comb through the case, and we're able to find you know, things that weren't looked at years ago that we're able to look at now, and get these cases across the finish line. So,
you know, and this review I think is really important, because too many times in the past, and you know, there's been cases where we went down the wrong path and they were looking at the wrong individual. Then later evidence comes back, and we have cases, and you know, I won't shy away from the fact that the Victoria Martins case, you know, the DA's office was very critical about it. And what these reviews do now is they put separate eyes on the cases, and they get different views in it, so that they could hopefully move the cases forward. And something that may have been overlooked in the past, somebody else is looking at it with a fresh set of eyes, and they're able to bring value to something that may have been missed.
thank you, Chief.
One other addition to that, Chief mentioned some detectives have left the homicide unit, and that's probably a good thing. There are some who have left or are leaving or retiring for whatever reason they're leaving, and they take such pride in their work that they have just committed to solving these crimes, and they don't want to leave until they solve all of their cases. So there's been a lot of that too. I think that leads a lot to these previous years being solved. So we took kind of a preliminary look at the criminal records of these suspects. Just going through court records, is about 75 out of the 117 had a criminal record, which is not surprising. 31 had no criminal record, and I think there should be 10 juveniles, or maybe 11, who I just didn't have time to look in and look at their juvenile records, so it's unknown at this point whether they had records as juveniles. And this is just a further look of what kind of record they had. This is just a percentage, so 64% had a criminal record, 26% no criminal record. This is the type of crimes, so 50% had violent crimes, violent criminal records, and I didn't look at convictions, so that doesn't include all convictions, but they do have charges or indictments. That cases may have been dropped. Just depends. It's a lot of work kind of going through all of those, and probably worth a little more diving into that. 20% had records of property crime, 11% drugs, 4% shoplifting, forgery types of charges, and 7% had DWI. And I think that, and then some of them had multiple. Some may have all categories.
I think the important thing here is if you look, the violent crimes and the property crimes makes up 78% of our homicide offenders. And what we're going to be doing in the new year is Deputy Commander Hartsock is putting a new team together that is going to focus on those two categories and increasing the amount of discovery and how we write criminal complaints for those individuals, because our goal is to increase the amount of information we give the DA's office to ask for detention, and hopefully we'll see more cases where detention is asked for, and we'll see more cases where detention is granted through the courts for pretrial detention. So we're looking at it as no longer like it's very difficult for us to get the state law changed on pretrial detention. We realize that, but we're going to devote resources to build the strongest cases on the front end. So hopefully that 78% there, we'll start seeing an increase in individuals. That's what the goal is going to be for the next year.
And so this looks at the type of weapon used in for these offenses involving these particular offenders. Not surprising, 86% had a firearm, used a firearm. 80% was a cutting instrument such as a knife. 3% was a vehicle, and I forget the other one, might have been just blunt force maybe. I want to say overall we're in the low 80% of all homicides occurring with a firearm, which is continues to go up. That's the concerning statistic, that a few years ago, I think 60% or so were involving a firearm, then it's 70%, and now it's just keep going up, more than 80%, and following national trends as well.
And since the onset of the pandemic, I think that there are a lot of national stats that show that 4 times the individuals are now carrying firearms that did in the past. And we've talked about this with officer-involved shootings. We've talked about this with homicides. Is intoxicated individuals make poor decisions. The more individuals we have armed with a firearm that aren't making responsible decisions with their state of mind and are in possession of firearms during the times when they're intoxicated, we're going to continue to see homicides. And we're going to continue to see those shootings at parties where individuals get into minor disputes. And that's the biggest trend we've seen over the past year, is minor disputes turn into homicides because of the presence of a gun and some kind of intoxicating liquor or drug that the individual is under at the time of the homicide.
The other thing with the firearms, I read an article as I was doing this research recently that a political science or a criminal justice expert was talking about how it may be more difficult to solve crimes involving firearms, and there's so many are involving firearms. It's definitely not the case here, I don't think, because we're actually solving a lot more with firearms. And I was talking with Deputy Chief Barker about this before, and we could probably credit our ShotSpotter, a lot of our technology the chief talked about. So ShotSpotter is helping us to really even differentiate who's shooting, how many types of guns are shooting at an incident. Our license plate readers, all the different technology we have is helping out officers to kind of track these downs and I think maybe start sooner and finding the offender.
So many times our homicides, and recently you've seen it, involves a stolen firearm. I even think the UNM homicide involved a stolen firearm. And that's why the city of Albuquerque started this new program where you save 2 shell casings, and those 2 shell casings, if your firearm is stolen, you later turn those over to police. That's key for us because it helps us give us more investigative leads down the road as to where maybe a firearm came from. So, we urge the public, save those 2 shell casings. If your firearm is stolen, have them available and present them to law enforcement so that we could kind of start tracking where these firearms may have came from. Because sometimes it's easier to try to solve a burglary than it is a homicide, or it could give you big leads in terms of a homicide. So we'll continue to be innovative and bring new programs to the city of Albuquerque, which assists us with some of our firearms crimes that we're seeing.
This is a look at the suspects by age. So I think there were 10, it actually should be 11, I think there were 17 under. There's one who's 18 now, but he was 17 at the time of the homicide. So 10 individuals, 41 between the ages of 18 and 25, and you can see the rest. This is, why don't you go to the next slide. if you compare, that's the same slide on the left. This slide on the right is the past 5 years combined, percentage-wise. So it's very similar, and actually the juveniles is actually down a little bit. Seems to be the biggest thing I noticed there. So it's kind of hard. We do see individuals, either victims or offenders who are juveniles, and it always seems to be like that's happening a lot or that's a trend, but it may or may not necessarily be the case. So it looks like it's been down a little bit this year, but definitely some high profile ones, and definitely I think there's a couple who are 14 years old, so that seems to capture a lot of the attention. And here's just the breakdown of the ages.
Can you go back to that one slide again? You know, and I think this is why it's important that we remember, if you look, you know, over half of our homicides involve somebody 18 to 35 years of age. And I know we have young adult court, great programs, support it greatly, focuses on young adults 18 to 25 years of age, and sometimes they get people a little bit older, but we have to keep pushing those interventions through the courts, and I think this is where there has to be a balance. You know, 50% of our individuals who were arrested this year had a prior history, and I'll say it, and we've said it before, like, those individuals need to stay in jail. But only a quarter of our homicides involve somebody with a previous property crimes arrest, and only, I think it was 10% involved individual with under the influence of drugs or with drug type arrests. That's where we have to have the support networks to get individuals out of those lifestyles at earlier ages, and we have to have that balance. Violent people stay in jail, drug addicts get drug treatment, individuals with mental illness get some kind of support, and we help them through that. But the vast majority of our homicides are happening at these ages, and as a community, we need to build better processes into straightening or giving people resources to get out of the lifestyle at those ages if we're ever going to see a true huge reduction in violent crime within the city of Albuquerque.
And on the other side of that, we have the violence intervention program that focuses on a lot of these young people using guns. So it remains to be seen, you know, whether that's having an impact on actual homicides or shootings. But it's encouraging anyway that might be having an impact. So this is a look at race and ethnicity. Hispanics, the largest percentage, which is the largest percentage in the, these are pure actual numbers, which is higher than the percentage in the actual population. So that's a factor. I think historically it's been the case. If you go to the next slide, we can compare to the past. So once again, that's the one on the left side. The one on the right is the past 5 years. So it's very similar, except if you look at Black Americans, seemed like this last year overrepresents by quite a bit, going up to 20%. And then white individuals are much lower. This is looked at by gender, which shouldn't be much of a surprise. Mid-80s to high 80 percentage are male, and 12 to 16% are female. That's the last one. Okay. And that's the last slide.
You know, the one thing I want to say is, like, this is great teamwork by a lot of individuals that are here. It's not, a lot of times our homicide team gets a lot of credit to, Commander Vega, Deputy Chief Barker for all the changes they've made, Lieutenant Del Greco, but our crime lab also has done a fabulous job in ensuring that we get evidence back quickly and that we're able to quickly move on cases. And I look at it like a two-pronged approach. We worked hard to get our investigators to the point where they're proactive, they're out, they're solving these cases, they're getting outside views. And the mayor's done a great job in ensuring that our crime lab has the technology and the experience and the equipment needed to quickly get evidence back and start solving these cases. We know that NIBINS was a big part of a lot of these cases during the course of the year, and we're slowly getting to the point where we're able to get results back rather quickly, a turnaround time sometimes of minutes on some of the key cases. So we want to thank the administration, the mayor, everybody who supported us in getting the technology to the crime lab. I want to thank the crime lab people here today. Nick, Paul, thank you guys for your hard work. Sometimes it's lost that every homicide has detectives that are dispatched to it, but they also have a crime scene team that's dispatched to it, and that crime scene team probably gets called out more than any other team within the city of Albuquerque. And we can't have success on the investigative side if we don't have success on the evidence gathering side, because that evidence that's being gathered is key for us getting those cases. So it's not lost upon us that our crime lab, a lot of them are professional staff, not sworn officers, and they do a fabulous job in making sure that they support homicide with everything that they need.
Before we take questions, I just want to point out too, I think another important part of this is the mayor has the Metro Crime Initiative. We're doing this year again. We'll be pushing that out. We've already highlighted some of that, and we'll be talking with legislators, and I'll be sending this to the legislature, this slide. Chief recently sent a letter to the Legislative Finance Committee. I think I sent it out to the media. And one of the things that we're concerned about, and I think the legislature has to really pay attention to, is, you know, this is 119, well, maybe 100 and just over 100 actual people arrested in jail right now, and will be facing trial, in addition to many others, for murder charges. And that's going to have a huge impact on the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the court system. So within the next year, 2 years, we'll be seeing these cases cycle through, in addition to many others. And so we've called on the legislature to really invest the resources into the entire criminal justice system. We don't want to see these cases, you know, pled out or fall through the cracks because there's not sufficient resources to try them. And you know, and they deserve their day in court, and they should have their defense attorneys and the courts the sufficient number of judges. So that's another part of this.
You know, and I'm glad Gilbert brought that up, because it is important. This isn't about us pointing fingers at each other. This is about the Albuquerque Police Department is standing here today, along with the mayor of the city of Albuquerque, asking our legislators to ensure that our criminal justice system as a whole is functioning the way it needs to. And it's not often that you'll hear a police chief say, let's make sure that the defense attorneys and the public defender's office has all the resources they need. What I'm saying is, let's make sure that that office has all the resources it needs. Let's make sure that our prosecutors are paid properly and that they have all the resources they need. And let's make sure that our courts have all the resources they need. This isn't alone about the Albuquerque Police Department lowering homicide rates. This is about a functioning, great criminal justice system, and our goal is to advocate for everybody to get the funding that they need so they can be as fortunate as we are. I talked about it earlier. We have a ton of technology that has been brought into the Albuquerque Police Department in the last 5 years, somewhere to the tune of, we're probably approaching $70 million in technology has been brought to us. We want that same investment in the criminal justice partners so that we have a strong criminal justice system, because we've said it from the very beginning. The Albuquerque Police Department alone cannot solve crime. We need a fully functional, well-supported criminal justice system. And I hope that everybody out there listening that has the ability to either vote for legislation or push for legislation remembers that this is about a complete system working correctly, and let's invest in all parts of the system now that we have a surplus of money.
You have any questions?
Chief Gilbert, you mentioned the parties that have been happening and like the petty disputes because of alcohol and guns. I was just wondering if that party patrol that was like decommissioned back in 2019, if there's any talks about possibly bringing that back.
We need to look at that. I mean, I was a big supporter of Party Patrol. I always have been. I helped establish it back early in my career as a sergeant, and I think it had value back then, but we definitely would have to modify it to today's day and age. I know that towards the end of my first run at Party Patrol, we were seeing the difficulties in getting into homes and the legalities of being able to establish when we could enter and when we couldn't. And I think those questions are even more prevalent in today's day and age, especially with the fact that we're under a consent decree and every use of force is viewed upon, and all those legal questions need to be answered. And there's been so many changes in how we process those. One simple use of force to put down a whole Party Patrol team for the night. And I think we also have to look at the fact that we just hit 18 officer-involved shootings, and we know that there are more guns. And the one thing I'll tell you about back then, and I worked Party Patrol for years, is it was very seldom that we actually came across a firearm. It was a rarity. With the amount of firearms that are at parties now, we have to take a strong look and say, is this the proper response at this point in time? And are we gonna have more officer-involved shootings because of it? So there are a lot of things that need to be considered. as we move forward, we have to take cautious steps, and we need to make sure that we do this in a way that is going to address the party problem, but at the same time is not going to increase our officer-involved shootings, because I guarantee you this much, there will be a lot of questions, and rightfully so, asked if we end up in a string of officer-involved shootings at parties with teenaged individuals.
Well, on the topic of parties and shootings, would you consider that a trend that we're seeing, wrong place, wrong time kind of homicides here?
You know, I think that a trend would have to be a large portion, and we still don't have a large portion of our homicides occurring at parties. They get a lot of notoriety, but I would still say that the majority of our homicides are conflict within the community at private homes or establishments such as hotels or motels. So yes, there is a concern with the party calls and individuals who have lost their lives at these party calls, but our overall biggest trend is still the calls we're seeing at homes where there's a minor conflict in the street or among small groups of individuals.
You also brought up the Muslim men murders. Is there any update on motive on that with Homicide?
You know, I don't have the details. That case, do you have any update, George?
No update. The case has been turned over to the DA's office at this time, but if any new evidence does come up, we would definitely investigate it. But right now it's with the DA's office.
Matt?
You know, did you guys look at how many of these suspects were on pretrial release at the time of the homicide? Was that?
Did not, no.
No, we didn't. And you know, I do want to further break this down now towards the end of the year. As the year ended, the goal is at the beginning of the year, really break down those individuals. And I want to know how many arrests. Because obviously if there's an individual who had, if a multiple of individuals had 5 arrests, we got to establish a baseline that we could go back to the legislature and the courts and say, hey, look, we're seeing that the average homicide offender had 4 previous arrests, and this is something that you should take into consideration, because I do believe that there is still possible modification to pretrial release, and that we could provide more information so that more educated decisions could be made. But this is what Deputy Commander Hartsock is going to be working on during the course of next year, is breaking down data on current individuals and seeing what kind of trends or history they have, where we could start making solid statistic-based, fact-based recommendations to everybody to look at in terms of pretrial detention.
And you might ask the DA's office too. They were going to supply me with kind of summaries of all these offenders, and we just didn't get it before the news conference.
Okay. I had another question. Do you guys know where these young people are getting their guns? Because I ask it a lot after these cases happen, and I don't really get an answer. Like the one on Baton, I think you had 2 kids who were like 14 who had like a rifle and a pistol, and like it's just like, I'm just kind of curious if you guys are looking into that, if you're getting answers on that.
You know, the number one way is the black market. We know that over the course of the past several years, we average somewhere near 1,000 firearms stolen from vehicles throughout the city. That is 1,000 reported firearms. And I would venture to say the number of firearms actually stolen is above that, because some individuals won't report it. So the amount of stolen firearms in our community is a concern, and it is something that we know that is being used to supply our youth with firearms in the community.
But usually, like, that's written in these reports. Like, usually, like, you know, an officer will do their due diligence, and they'll be like, well, this, like, they'll, like, write it in the complaint, because then they're charged with something else or something. And I just don't see that a lot, and I was curious if, like, you guys are finding out that, like, are relatives buying these guns for them? I mean, are those questions being asked, like, during these investigations, where these young people are getting their guns?
You know, and I'll let Commander Vega address that specifically, what they're doing, but I know that on most of our like officer involved shootings, and one of the areas that we're working on with ATF is called E-Trace, and one of the things we're trying to E-Trace, and one of the things we're starting to do is we want to establish that we want to see if there was a straw purchaser, and that is one of the new initiatives that we'll be working on in the course of the next year. Cecily, you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Chief, is that's absolutely something that our detectives look into. Our crime lab does a trace on it. We find out where that firearm came from. And we do oftentimes find out that a firearm was stolen and never reported, like Chief said. That's why, as part of the Metro Crime Initiative, one of the things that we're supporting is the Benny Hargrove Act, to hold people accountable who aren't properly storing their firearms. And George, you can go into any detail as far as the detectives, but the initial report might not have that information because it takes some time to investigate that, but that's absolutely something we follow up on.
I just want to add, I know that Lieutenant Nelson had mentioned in the past that a lot of them are dealing with straw purchases with younger people who want a new gun. They don't want to be in possession of a stolen gun, and they just get someone else to purchase it for them. And then I think the other case, maybe Lieutenant Del Greco can talk about it, but a lot of guns aren't recovered at the scene, so they don't know that right away. So.
Yeah, man, so obviously when we get on scene, we'll find evidence of a crime, but it's very rare that we'll actually have a firearm that's on scene for us to do an e-trace on. So in the event of an officer-involved shooting, typically we'll be able to recover that firearm, but for most of our homicides, we rarely recover firearms from the scene.
I know you guys mentioned you had more attempts this year to help in the homicide investigations. Were you seeing more attempts specifically in 2022 than you guys have seen in previous years that helped as a resource?
Yes.
And then also, do you guys have an updated number on the homicides for this year, since we're approaching the end of the year?
It's 119 homicide victims, 112 homicide cases.
How many are unsolved from this year?
So 68 are solved. What's the math of that? 40.
About 60, I think 62%ish was the last number I saw. We could,
51.
what?
Yeah, about 51 or so.
And you mentioned, the ask for the legislature, do you have any specific asks for them, in terms of funding or the resources that you're talking about getting from legislators?
I think the Legislative Finance Committee needs to do a study, and they need to figure out what exactly is needed with all parts of the criminal justice system. I know last year there was a lot of emphasis, and they spoke about what the Albuquerque Police Department could do. I sat there in February and I heard their concerns, and it was increased clearance rates. The Albuquerque Police Department has done what was asked of them by the Legislative Finance Committee, and we are now asking them to look to see what other recommendations do they have for the entire criminal justice system and not just the Albuquerque Police Department.
On that point, though, too, we made a huge progress on that, but it hasn't immediately led to lower homicides. Hopefully in the future it will, but I think that was oversimplified by the committee, suggesting that if we just solve everything, homicides are going to go down. So I think it's much more complicated than that.
And when we're on the topic of these trends and things, this year, would you say any glaring trend that's different from last year?
No, I think that the one thing I would say is we have seen more individuals in some type of mental health crisis that have now become homicide offenders. We know we had a homicide off of Tramway when an individual with no criminal history that we knew of, randomly just executed some individuals. We've had some horrific domestic violence type calls with individuals. So I think, to me, just anecdotally thinking, it's going to be the increase in mental health related homicides. George, Cecily?
I think individual disrespect is something, a continuing trend that we're seeing, and a lot of that involves social media. I know we did that public safety announcement about that specifically in reference to parties, but we're also seeing that just in general, whether that's purchasing drugs or meeting someone to make a purchase. The other individuals coming and we're seeing robberies as a result of that. So we just caution social media, and if you're going to meet someone legally, obviously try to do that at a police station, but we are seeing a lot of drug interactions being involved with social media and shootings as a result.
The individual disrespect is also a big deal. It's like when I first came on 27 years ago, when two individuals had a feud with one another, they may not know it. I mean, you had a gang member from one gang in the North Valley talking about a gang member in the South Valley, and they were disrespecting them to their peers. It stayed there. There was really very little communication between the two groups. But social media has changed that. You could post something on social media and you could be criticizing one member from another group in a different part of town, and they're not even gang members anymore. And there's that case of individual disrespect, and then these individuals run into each other, and there's a known beef between these individuals because they've seen it and they've gone at it over social media, where in the past that wasn't the case. So without a doubt, social media also has led to a trend in where individuals are feeling that disrespect from one another that in the past they never even heard of.
I think homeless individuals too. I get a
Homeless,
sense there's
yes.
more, in the past there'd be a certain amount of homeless victims of homicide or violent crime. We have seen more offenders, I think, in kind of crimes, you know, victim and offender are homeless. And basically individual disrespect kind of that root of that as well, but.
When being ahead to next year and kind of the hope for even better numbers, what do you want to continue to see in the department, and what maybe new things do you want to?
I think that I'd like to see VIP continue to intervene with that age group we were talking about. I'd like to see a big investment in young adult courts and processes within the city. I'd like to see our homicide unit continue. We've added some more digital forensic type people that will help us with the electronic type evidence gathering. I think we want to focus on warrants this whole next year. We've started really working the warrants hard. We want to focus on those warrants again throughout the course of the year. And I think the biggest thing we want to do is we want to ensure that we're moving swiftly and we're taking individuals into custody, and that we are educating the community on some of the trends. So many of these trends parents can help with. Educating their kids on the dangers of parties. Parents not having parties for their kids and thinking they're going to control who comes and goes from the parties. So I think that there's a lot of things that could be done, but the biggest thing I'm looking for is us to continue what we've started, continuing to build a bench of investigators for the future in all areas. And then the last part is, I'm very hopeful in our program that we're starting with Deputy Commander Hartsock that we could really start focusing on who may be the next offender coming up and how we could detain some of those violent people or build stronger cases and do our part to present the best possible information to the DA's office and the courts, so that hopefully we could get detention in some of these cases where we feel somebody should be detained.
And I know Gilbert mentioned this earlier on in the presentation, but for those families that are still dealing with an unsolved case, could you just mention, Chief, what would you say to them right now?
Never give up. Just in August of 2021, I was able to deliver a message to a family in Taos about a case of their daughter being murdered that I had grown up and knew, Althea Oakley. And just last Friday, I spoke to the family and the relief that 33 years later, I think it was 33 years later, the case was solved. That don't give up, that there is hope, and we have not forgotten those, and I've committed to the community and those families that we will have advancements in our cold case. Some of these individuals that are being brought back to work on some of these older cases, another testament. More cases this year solved from previous years than before, is that we're not going to abandon these cases. We use the term loosely here that we called them, they were like orphaned cases, and we want to make sure that those cases are brought to light and that we're taking a second look at them and that we're moving as quickly as we can on them. I think another big step is the case files. Bringing information back to these cases and working on those cases and getting the word out to the public to see if anybody remembers something, or somebody who may have known something 10 years ago and just all of a sudden, hopefully they get the urge to say, I need to say something.
Anything else? Okay, thank you,
All
everybody.
right, thanks.